One night with her billionaire boss, she vanished. Then 5 years later, his secret unveiled. The memories of a child shaped Samuel Castillo, born into a family that from the outside appeared flawless. A grand mansion in Mexico City, luxury cars gleaming in the driveway, lavish parties filled with guests from the upper echelons of society. But behind the heavy oak doors of that house, there was nothing but coldness and endless arguments. His father, Ricardo Castillo, was a ruthless businessman in the corporate world and an equally ruthless man at home. He loved Samuel's mother, Eva Morales, or at least he believed he did. But it was not the kind of tender love people dream about. It was possessive, suffocating, a love where only one person was allowed to breathe while the other slowly withered away. Samuel remembered the nights of his childhood, crouching behind the staircase, his wide eyes filled with fear as he listened to his parents argue. His mother, Ava, had once been a radiant woman, but over time, she became quiet and melancholic. Whenever she smiled, it never reached her eyes, and whenever she fell silent, the entire house seemed to freeze. There was a time when Samuel was about 8 years old when his mother tried to leave. She had held him close, whispering in his ear that they would have a new life somewhere far away, maybe Oaxaca, her hometown, where no one could force her to live like a puppet in this golden prison. But before they could escape, his father found out. Samuel still remembered that night vividly. His mother had fallen to her knees, tears dripping onto the cold marble floor, while Ricardo stood towering over her, his voice calm but laced with absolute authority. "Did you really think you could leave me, Ava?" She never tried to leave again. And from that moment, Samuel understood that love was not the beautiful thing people wrote about in fairy tales. Love was a cage. Once you stepped inside, you would never escape. As time passed, Samuel grew up with those bitter lessons engraved in his mind. He became a man who was certain of two things. He would never love anyone, and he would never have children. He refused to fall into the same toxic cycle as his parents. He didn't want to love someone so much that he needed to control them. And more importantly, he didn't want his child to endure the kind of childhood he had. With intelligence, determination, and the same ruthless nature he had inherited from his father, Samuel built a financial empire, becoming one of the youngest billionaires in the world. Under his leadership, Castillo Financial Group dominated numerous markets in Mexico City, orchestrating billion-dollar deals with precision and power. Yet despite his wealth and influence, Samuel remained distant and cold. He had no friends, no interest in meaningless social gatherings, and he let no one into his world. To his employees, he was the perfect CEO, but no one dared to get too close. To his rivals, he was a nightmare who never made mistakes. To women, he was nothing more than a wealthy but emotionless man. Samuel believed he could live his entire life this way until he met Amalia. Fate's unexpected turn. Amalia Vega had never imagined that her life would become intertwined with a man as cold and distant as Samuel Castillo. She cherished warmth, connection, and genuine relationships. But fate had a way of playing tricks on people, and Samuel entered her life in a way no one could have predicted. As one of Mexico City's top event planners, Amalia was no stranger to extravagant parties for the elite. She had worked with politicians, movie stars, and powerful billionaires, yet none had left as strong an impression on her as Samuel Castillo. His financial empire was hosting a charity gala in Mexico City to raise funds for underprivileged children, one of the most prestigious events of the year for Castillo Financial Group, and Amalia was entrusted with organizing it. She had heard of Samuel before, a CEO who never appeared in tabloids with romantic scandals, a man who kept the world at a distance. But meeting him in person still took her by surprise. His aura of cold detachment was palpable in every gesture, every glance. He stood in the middle of a crowded room, yet he seemed utterly separate from it. No one dared approach him unless necessity demanded it. But Amalia was not one to be intimidated by power or distance. She approached Samuel as she would any other guest, with professionalism and ease. "Senor Castillo, I hope you're satisfied with tonight's event," she said, her voice steady. Samuel turned his head toward her, his sharp gaze lingering on her face for a brief moment before he gave a small nod. "I have no complaints, no words of praise." But for Samuel, that was already a rare acknowledgement. Amalia simply smiled. "Then I'm relieved." Samuel raised an eyebrow slightly. This woman was different. She wasn't flustered by him, nor was she trying to flatter him or seek his attention. She simply spoke to him naturally, and that was what made Amalia the only person who could talk to Samuel comfortably. The gala was a success, but grand events like this always had after parties. Samuel usually had no interest in such gatherings, but for some reason that night, he didn't leave right away. Perhaps it was because of Amalia. As the event wound down, Samuel remained at the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He rarely drank much, but tonight he allowed himself a small indulgence. And somehow, Amalia found her way beside him. Senor Castillo, it seems like it's been a long day, Amalia remarked, ordering a glass of wine for herself. Samuel looked at her, and for the first time that night, a faint smile appeared on his lips. You don't have to call me senor. Samuel is fine. Amalia was slightly surprised, but quickly smiled back. All right then, Samuel. They sat there, drinking and talking like old friends. There were no intrusive questions, no unnecessary curiosity about his personal life. Amalia didn't try to pry into his world, and that made him feel at ease. And somehow, when they had both had just enough to forget the rules, Samuel leaned in toward Amalia, and she didn't pull away. At first, it was just a brief kiss, but as their breaths intertwined, as Samuel felt the softness of her lips and the warmth of her presence, the barriers between them shattered. They left the party together, and that night, for the first time in his life, Samuel didn't care about what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the curtains of his Mexico City penthouse, Samuel woke up with Amalia still peacefully asleep beside him. He wasn't used to this feeling. Usually, after a night with a woman, she would expect something, a follow-up date, a distant promise. And that was why he always ended things immediately. But Amalia was different. She woke up, stretched comfortably, then turned to him with a light-hearted smile. Good morning, Samuel. No expectations, no demands. For some reason, that made him feel unburdened. And so, they continued seeing each other. They dined together, watched movies, shared stories about their lives, just like two friends. But on some long nights, they also sought each other out, finding warmth in kisses and quiet embraces. A nameless relationship. Amalia Vega couldn't remember exactly when her relationship with Samuel Castillo had become like this. No promises, no official titles. Yet they remained by each other's side in a strange, unspoken way. She wasn't the only woman who had ever spent the night with Samuel, but she was the only one who could sit across from him the next morning without being pushed away. They shared breakfast, watched movies on quiet weekend nights, and spent long afternoons chatting about nothing and everything. It was all so natural, so easy, and yet that very ease was what hurt Amalia the most. Samuel always kept his distance from the world. He had no real friends, no family he was truly close to. To everyone else, Samuel Castillo was a cold billionaire, a sharp businessman, a man so detached he seemed almost devoid of emotion. But with Amalia, he was different. She had seen those rare moments when exhaustion flickered across his face, when he unconsciously reached for her hand without realizing it, when he silently watched her on nights when neither of them spoke. She knew Samuel didn't believe in love, but Amalia loved him anyway. Despite everything, she didn't expect a confession, nor did she hope for promises of a future together. She only wished that one day Samuel would realize he didn't have to run from love, that he didn't have to push her away. But Samuel wasn't what she wished for. Amalia loved children. She loved holding them, seeing their innocent smiles, listening to their tiny voices learning to speak. Ever since she was little, growing up in Oaxaca, she had dreamed of having a small family where she could raise her children with all the love she had to give. But Samuel was different. One evening, as they sat on the couch in his Mexico City penthouse watching a movie, Amalia absent-mindedly asked, Have you ever thought about having kids? The seemingly harmless question made Samuel immediately tense up. He didn't turn to look at her, but Amalia could see the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his fingers tightened around his glass of whiskey. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice low and firm. No. Amalia frowned slightly, pressing gently. Why not? A question cracks the silence in Mexico City. Amalia's dreams clash with Samuel's walls. One night sparked something real, but can love survive a past that caged his heart? Timeline Stories is just warming up. Will she stay or slip away? Don't miss what's next. You don't like children? Amalia Vega asked, her voice soft but curious. That's not it, Samuel Castillo exhaled sharply, setting his glass down on the coffee table in his Mexico City penthouse. I just have no intention of having kids. Ever. The finality in his tone made Amalia falter. She had once hoped that maybe Samuel simply hadn't thought about it yet, but now it was clear. He hadn't just not considered it, he had already decided, and his decision was absolute. She forced a smile, hiding the weight settling in her chest. Why? Samuel was silent for a long time. Then he simply said, I don't want to be like my father. His words squeezed her heart. She had heard Samuel mention his father, Ricardo Castillo, once before, a powerful, wealthy man who controlled his mother, Eva Morales, to the point that she had no freedom, no real life of her own. Samuel had grown up in a home where love was not care, but possession, and perhaps that was why he feared that if he ever had children, he would become that kind of father. Amalia knew Samuel wouldn't change overnight. She didn't blame him for his past wounds, nor for his inability to love her the way she wanted, but sometimes she wondered if she was leading herself down a road with no way out, and she loved him. But Samuel could never give her what she longed for most, a family and a child, a complete life. Every time she looked at him, she felt like she was holding a handful of sand. If she let go, or if she held on too tightly, it would slip away just the same. But if she continued like this, how long could she endure? She didn't want to force Samuel, didn't want to pressure him, but her love for him wasn't enough to change the truth. They wanted different things in life. Samuel didn't believe in love, and Amalia couldn't stop loving him. When a new life begins, Amalia stared at the pregnancy test in her hand. Her heart beat so rapid she could hear it pounding in her chest. Two red lines appeared clearly before her eyes. She was pregnant. She should have been terrified. An unplanned pregnancy, without a partner to share the joy and fears with, should have made her anxious. But it didn't. A smile unconsciously formed on Amalia's lips. For as long as she could remember, growing up in Oaxaca, she had always wanted a child, a tiny life to love and care for, to build a real family filled with love, not invisible chains and fear like the one Samuel had experienced. And now, that dream had become a reality. She gently placed a hand over her abdomen, where a small life was beginning to form. Just the thought of it was enough to fill her heart with warmth and happiness. But then she thought about Samuel. She recalled the moments they had shared, the times she had cautiously brought up the topic of children. Each time his response was the same, firm and unwavering. I don't want kids. Never. I don't want to be like my father. Samuel didn't hate children, she knew that, but he was haunted by his own childhood, by the fear of possession, by the pain love could bring. And because of that, he never wanted to be a father. She knew that if she told him, he wouldn't be happy. He might even look at her with that cold, distant gaze she dreaded. She knew how much he despised obligations. Samuel was not an irresponsible man, but Amalia didn't want her child to grow up with a father who saw them as a burden. She didn't want to see Samuel's empty eyes as he forced himself to accept something he had never wanted. And most of all, she couldn't bear the thought of her child growing up without real love from their father. For days, Amalia struggled with whether or not to tell Samuel. She wanted to believe that upon hearing this news, he would change, that he would realize having a child wasn't a burden, it was a miracle. But that was just her hope. Reality was different. She knew Samuel wasn't the kind of man who could easily change his mind. He didn't believe in love, he didn't want a family, and, most importantly, he didn't want children. So, she knew what she had to do. She couldn't force Samuel to be a father if he wasn't ready, just as she couldn't stay beside a man who could never give her what she truly wanted, no matter how much she loved him. Amalia knew she could no longer think only about herself, and she now had another life inside her, a child she needed to protect and love above all else. She couldn't let her baby grow up in coldness and indifference. She had to leave. She would take all the love she had for Samuel and give it to this tiny life inside her. She decided to walk away from this fragile, unreciprocated love. Once her decision was clear, Amalia began making preparations. She resigned from her job, packed her belongings, and searched for a new city to start over. She chose somewhere far away, a place where no one knew who she was, where no one knew about her relationship with Samuel Castillo, a place where she could live a peaceful life with her child, free from the shadows of the past. On the day she left, she stood in front of her Mexico City apartment one last time, silently taking in all the memories she and Samuel had made there. She didn't write a goodbye letter. She didn't leave behind any trace, because Amalia knew if Samuel truly wanted to find her, he would. But if he didn't, then perhaps that would be the clearest answer about their love. And she would not regret her decision, because from this moment on, it was no longer about Samuel. It was about her and her child. What about you? If you were Amalia, would you leave or stay and tell Samuel the truth? The void in his heart. Samuel Castillo had never been the romantic type. He didn't believe in love, nor did he believe in long-term relationships. So when Amalia left, he didn't think much of it. Maybe she was just upset, frustrated about something, or caught up in a big new project. Maybe in a few days, a few weeks, she would come back, just like always. Hadn't they always had an arrangement with no commitments, no labels, no promises, no love? So really, her disappearance shouldn't have been surprising, or at least that was what Samuel kept telling himself. But then time passed. 1 month, 2 months, and Amalia never returned. He called her. She didn't pick up. He went to her old workplace. They told him she had resigned and moved away. No one knew where she had gone. That was when it hit him. She was really gone. A strange sense of loss settled in his chest, an emptiness he couldn't quite define. But still, he carried on as usual. He buried himself in work, drowned in numbers and billion-dollar deals, expanding his empire in Mexico City, anything to ignore the emptiness growing inside him. A buried truth. 5 years, a long enough time for a person to change. But for Samuel, some things remained the same. He was still the same cold, rational man, still buried in his work. Yet, no matter how busy he was, when the silence of his Mexico City penthouse settled in each night, Amalia's face would always resurface in his mind. Until today, Samuel had never thought he would set foot in a small town like this. This was not a place for financial moguls like him, but he was here for business, to acquire a promising startup his company had been eyeing near Oaxaca. After a long meeting, his assistant suggested stopping by a small cafe on the corner of the street. Samuel didn't care. A cafe was just a cafe. But then, the moment he stepped inside, his entire world froze. His grip on his coffee cup tightened. His heart pounded in his chest, because sitting by the window, bathed in the soft afternoon sunlight, was a familiar figure, Amalia. 5 years had passed, but she was the same. The same gentle eyes, the same smile he once knew so well. But she wasn't alone. Beside her, a little boy, around 4 years old, was happily chatting away, his eyes sparkling with joy. Samuel couldn't breathe. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, because that child looked exactly like him. In that moment, everything shattered. Amalia had been pregnant, and she had left to raise their child alone. A sharp pain shot through Samuel's chest. Memories came rushing back. The times Amalia had spoken about wanting a family, about having children. He had dismissed her words, thinking they had nothing to do with him. The time she had asked him about having kids, and he had coldly shut down the conversation. The silent, unreadable way she had looked at him, like she was holding back something he never understood. The moment she had left without a word, without an explanation. Back then, he hadn't understood why she had disappeared without a trace. Now he did. She hadn't wanted him to know, hadn't wanted him to feel obligated, hadn't wanted their child to grow up with a father who never wanted them. A surge of anger rose within him. Not anger at Amalia, anger at himself, because it was his own indifference, his own cruelty, that had pushed her away. He had made her believe that he didn't want the baby. And now he had lost 5 years of his son's life. Samuel clenched his fists, his eyes darkening. He couldn't wait another second. He stood up abruptly and strode toward Amalia's table. But just as he was a few steps away, a tall, well-dressed man suddenly stepped in front of him, approaching Amalia. His deep, steady voice rang out. "Amalia, have you been waiting long?" Samuel froze. The man looked at the child and smiled warmly, reaching down to gently ruffle his hair. "Son, have you been waiting for Daddy?" The air shattered. Samuel's entire body went rigid. He looked at Amalia, at the child, at the stranger who had just called his son Daddy. A cold chill ran down his spine. His chest tightened until it was hard to breathe. Had she moved on? Was this why she had disappeared? Samuel couldn't believe what he was seeing. For the first time in his life, he felt completely out of control. Everything he thought he understood, everything he believed he could reclaim, was slipping away before his very eyes. A truth buried deep. A stranger's smile in Oaxaca. A child calls another man daddy, and Samuel's world crumbles. Did Amalia build a new life, or is the truth still buried deeper? Timeline Stories drops a bombshell. Will he fight for what's his, or lose it all again? The next part's a reckoning. Stay tuned. Samuel Castillo stood frozen, the world around him shattered. That stranger had just called the boy his son. His chest tightened so much it felt impossible to breathe. Why? Why was this happening? He had always thought that what he had with Amalia Vega was nothing more than a casual relationship, an arrangement where they were equals, free to come and go as they pleased, no commitments, no expectations, no control. A woman entered his life, then left without strings, without responsibilities. But now, seeing her beside another man, hearing that man call the child who looked just like him his son, his heart broke. For the first time in his life, Samuel felt something akin to loss, a raw, piercing pain. And he realized Amalia had given him years of her youth without a title, without promises, without any reason other than the pure love she had for him. She had never asked for anything, neither wealth, nor status, nor power, nor even love in return. She had simply been there, unconditionally, and he had taken it for granted. So much so that when she disappeared from his life in Mexico City, all he felt was a vague emptiness, one he never truly acknowledged. He had missed her, had felt something missing when she left, but it had never hurt like this. Now, seeing her with someone else, seeing the hope he didn't even realize he had disappear in an instant, his heart ached in a way he had never known before. Everything he had believed about love, about family, all of it crumbled. He had once thought that love was a chain, a suffocating force like the one his father, Ricardo Castillo, had placed on his mother, Eva Morales. He had believed that family was nothing more than a forced bond between two people who would ultimately destroy each other. He had spent his entire life running from those things. And yet now, as he looked at Amalia, the woman who had once loved him so completely, now smiling at another man, as he looked at the little boy with his own eyes, calling someone else dad, Samuel realized that he had been wrong. So very, very wrong. He didn't know what Amalia had gone through in the past 5 years, didn't know how lonely she must have been carrying his child on her own, didn't know how long she had waited for him before finally losing hope, and then she had moved on. She had found someone else. That truth cut into Samuel like a knife, because deep down, he knew the man who should have been standing beside her, the man who should have been hers, was him. The man who should have been that child's father was him. But he had thrown it all away. He had pushed Amalia away. The truth unveiled. Samuel received the investigation report just hours later. His hands were unsteady as he opened the file. Amalia Vega, 29 years old. 5 years ago, she moved to Oaxaca. She lives with her son, Oliver Vega, currently 4 years old. Samuel's chest tightened. 5 years ago. That meant she had left Mexico City and come here immediately after him. He didn't need a DNA test to know the truth. The boy was his. But what caught Samuel's attention even more was the information about the man beside her. Daniel Ortiz, 34 years old, chief executive officer of a major tech company, has been pursuing Amalia for the past 5 years. The last sentence sent a shock through Samuel's system. For 5 years, that man had been by her side, but they weren't married. A flicker of hope ignited in Samuel's chest, and if Amalia truly loved Daniel, they would have been married by now. But she hadn't. She didn't belong to Daniel. That meant Samuel still had a chance. Without hesitation, he got into his car and drove straight to Amalia's house, a small home in a quiet Oaxaca neighborhood. As his car pulled up in front of the gate, he sat there for a moment, staring at the modest but warm-looking house. A peaceful life, a life without him. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked to the door. The moment he rang the doorbell, the door swung open. Amalia stood there, her eyes widened at the sight of him, as if she couldn't believe he was really standing in front of her. 4 years apart, but she was just as beautiful as ever. The same eyes, the same smile, one he had taken for granted. And now, she no longer belonged to him. Before Samuel could speak, a warm, deep voice came from inside the house. "Oliver, well done. Come here, buddy." Samuel froze. His gaze flickered past Amalia toward the living room. There, sitting on the floor, was Daniel Ortiz, calm, composed, and smiling, as he played with a small boy. A boy with jet black hair and bright, intelligent eyes identical to his own. Samuel's chest tightened. He stood still, watching as Daniel ruffled Oliver's hair affectionately. Oliver laughed, wrapping his tiny arms around Daniel's neck. His voice was light, carefree, and full of joy. "Daddy, look what I can do." It felt like someone had driven a knife straight into Samuel's heart. Amalia glanced at Samuel's expression but remained silent for a moment. The air between the three of them grew heavy. Then Daniel stood up. He looked at Samuel for a brief moment, his expression unreadable, before offering a polite nod. "Hello, I'm Daniel." His voice was calm. There was no hostility, no challenge. Samuel clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to remain composed. "Samuel," he replied, tension crackling in the air, though both men maintained a civil front. Daniel glanced at Amalia before speaking gently. "I'll be heading out now. Oliver, be good, all right?" "Yes," Oliver beamed, his bright eyes following Daniel as he turned to leave. Just before walking out, Daniel placed a reassuring hand on Amalia's shoulder, offering her a small, understanding smile. As the door closed behind him, the room suddenly felt suffocating. Samuel remained standing there, his eyes locked onto Amalia. She led Oliver into his room, then turned back to face him. "That boy," his voice was slow, deliberate. "He's my son, isn't he?" Amalia let out a quiet sigh. She didn't want to hide anymore. She couldn't hide anymore. "Yes." Samuel felt his entire world collapse. 5 years. For 5 years he had lived in ignorance, never knowing he had a child. His jaw clenched as he forced out the words, each syllable laced with raw emotion. "Why didn't you tell me?" His sharp gaze was filled with something unfamiliar. Pain. Amalia's fingers curled into fists, but she did not look away. "Samuel, do you really want to ask me that?" Her voice was calm, but firm. "Do you remember what you used to say to me? That you didn't want kids, that you were afraid of love, that you feared commitment? If I had told you I was pregnant back then, how do you think you would have reacted?" Samuel couldn't answer because she was right. Back then, he would have panicked. He would have felt trapped. But that didn't mean she had the right to take away his chance to be a father. "No matter what, he's still my son," he said, his voice dropping lower, restrained but firm. "You shouldn't have made that decision alone." Amalia let out a bitter chuckle. "I didn't make the decision alone. I made it for both of us. I didn't want my child to grow up with a father who only stayed out of obligation. If you had truly wanted a child, you would have realized it sooner. But you never looked for me in the past 5 years, did you?" Samuel went still. How could he argue with that? Because she was right again. He had never searched for her. He had always assumed she was just another woman passing through his life, that she would eventually return, as she always had. But she hadn't. Samuel took a deep breath, his gaze softening for the first time. "Amalia," he said slowly, "I'm sorry." Amalia froze. She had once longed to hear those words, but now that she had, they felt hollow. "There's no need to apologize, Samuel." She gave him a faint, tired smile. "I was never angry at you. I came into your life willingly, knowing full well that you didn't believe in love, that you didn't want a family. At first I thought if I loved you enough, you might change. But when I found out I was pregnant, I realized I couldn't keep chasing after something that was never meant to be." She exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window where Oliver was happily playing with his toys. "When I left, I stopped giving my love to you. I gave it all to our son." Silence fell over the room. Samuel felt as if he had lost something irreplaceable. It wasn't that Amalia no longer loved him. It was that she had learned to live without him. Amalia stared at Samuel, her breath slightly unsteady. "You want to meet him?" But could she really allow that to happen? For 4 years, she had raised Oliver alone. protecting him from any pain, shielding him from the heartbreak of being rejected by his own father. She never wanted him to grow up feeling unwanted. And now, Samuel had suddenly reappeared, demanding to see his son. Samuel, my son doesn't need you. Her voice was calm, but firm. Her words only made Samuel's gaze darken. That was your decision, Amalia, not his. His voice was low, but sharp. Have you ever considered that Oliver has the right to know his father? She bit her lip. Yes, Oliver did have that right, but she was afraid. Afraid that Samuel would only be here for a moment, only to leave again, once he realized he wasn't ready to be a father. Do you really think you can be a good father? She let out a bitter laugh. You don't even believe in love. You once told me you never wanted children, and now what? You've suddenly changed your mind. Samuel didn't answer immediately. He knew Amalia had every right to be angry. She had gone through a pregnancy alone, given birth alone, raised their son alone for 4 years, all because of the careless words and selfish decisions he had made in the past. He had never imagined himself as a father. But when he had seen Oliver in that cafe, seen his own son running into another man's arms and calling him Dad, it had crushed him. Samuel clenched his fists, his voice low but unwavering. I don't know if I can be a good father. A confession hangs heavy in Oaxaca. Samuel's sorry comes too late, but his son's laughter lingers. Amalia's guarded heart faces a father's plea. Will Oliver ever know the truth, or stay safe in her silence? Time Lens Stories teeters on the edge. Next part's a breaking point. Don't miss it. A father's promise. I don't know if I can be a good father, Samuel Castillo said, his voice low but honest. But I do know one thing. I won't let my son grow up not knowing who his real father is. Amalia Vega's grip tightened, her heart warring with itself, because deep down, she knew Oliver had the right to know his father. After a long moment of hesitation, Amalia finally agreed to let Samuel meet Oliver, but with one condition. You will not hurt him. Her voice was cold, her gaze sharp. If you think you can just meet him, and then disappear the moment you feel unsure, then don't meet him at all. Samuel gave a firm nod. He would not leave, not this time. They agreed to meet the next afternoon at a park near Amalia's home in Oaxaca. Samuel arrived early, but his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He had closed billion-dollar deals, faced some of the most ruthless businessmen in the world, but nothing had ever made him as nervous as he was now. He was about to meet his son. 4 years. 4 years had passed, and this would be the first time he would lay eyes on the child he should have been protecting since before he was even born. Then, at a distance, he saw them. Amalia walked toward him, holding the hand of a small boy with soft brown hair. Oliver. Samuel felt his chest tighten. The boy had his eyes. Amalia crouched down beside Oliver, speaking to him gently. Oliver, this is a friend of mine. His name is Samuel. She wasn't ready to tell Oliver the truth yet. She wanted to give them both time to adjust. Oliver looked up at Samuel, his bright blue eyes filled with curiosity. Mr. Samuel? The boy asked hesitantly. For the first time in his life, Samuel didn't know what to say. He had prepared 1,000 things in his mind, but now every word had vanished. Hello, Oliver. He finally spoke, his voice softer than it had ever been. Oliver tilted his head as if studying him, then out of nowhere he asked, Do you like superheroes? Samuel blinked, caught off guard. Superheroes? He had spent his entire life analyzing financial markets, outmaneuvering corporate giants, and yet the very first question from his son was about superheroes. Amalia let out a soft laugh at the rare moment of confusion on Samuel's face. Samuel looked at Oliver, then slowly nodded. Yes, I like superheroes. Oliver's face lit up. Then, do you know who's the strongest? Samuel thought for a moment before answering seriously. I think Iron Man is pretty strong. Oliver frowned. No way, Spider-Man is the strongest. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Yeah, Oliver said, his voice brimming with conviction, because Spider-Man can swing on webs, run really fast, and he's super nice, too. Samuel watched Oliver as he spoke, his little eyes shining with excitement as he passionately defended his favorite superhero. And for the first time in his life, Samuel felt something unfamiliar settle in his heart. He had never imagined having something this small and full of energy in his life. A little boy, pure and bright, bursting with curiosity and enthusiasm. A little boy who was his son. Samuel stared at Oliver, an overwhelming wave of emotions rising inside him. He had missed too much. The encounter at the conference. The International Economic Conference was being held in London that year, gathering the most influential figures in finance and business. Samuel entered the grand hall with his usual calm demeanor, his sharp gaze like that of a seasoned wolf in the financial world. He didn't enjoy these events, but for the sake of Castillo Financial Group, he attended nonetheless. Amid discussions about investment markets, a familiar name suddenly appeared on the list of speakers: Daniel Ortiz. Samuel narrowed his eyes slightly. Daniel Ortiz. That man, the one who had been by Amalia's side for 4 years, the one Oliver called Dad. Samuel's grip on his glass tightened. As soon as the discussion panel ended, he made his move. Daniel saw him too. Two men, both powerful, both successful, yet bound by an invisible thread. Amalia. Samuel. Daniel was the first to speak, his tone composed. Samuel nodded, keeping a polite front, though tension lingered beneath his calm exterior. Daniel studied him for a moment, then sighed. I'm guessing you want to talk about Amalia. Samuel didn't deny it. They moved to a quieter lounge in the hotel, where soft jazz played in the background. Samuel set his drink down, his gaze locked onto the man sitting across from him. I want to know what's between you and Amalia. His voice was direct, unwavering. Daniel let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. It's not what you'd think. Samuel frowned, waiting for an explanation. Leaning back in his chair, Daniel's expression turned distant, as if recalling something from long ago. I met Amalia on a rainy night. She was exhausted and nearly collapsed while pregnant with Oliver. I took her to the hospital, and from that day on, I decided to help her. He paused, giving Samuel time to absorb the words. I didn't stay with her to take her away from you. I always knew her heart never belonged to me. You're the one she loves, Samuel. And sadly, you never realized how much. Samuel clenched his fists under the table. Daniel smiled faintly, though there was something unreadable in his eyes. You know, I pursued Amalia for 4 years, but not once did she let me into her heart. She always turned me down, gently but firmly, because, Daniel stopped, locking eyes with Samuel, because you were already too deeply engraved in her heart. The word struck Samuel like a blow to the chest. He had always known Amalia loved him, but he had never imagined that even after leaving, even after building a new life, she had never truly let him go. Daniel continued, his tone calm, but tinged with quiet bitterness. I adopted Oliver, but I never tried to replace you. I was only there as a friend, as someone to protect Amalia and your son. But then Daniel's expression sharpened, his voice laced with challenge. If you truly love Amalia, if you truly want your family back, he leaned forward slightly, then this time, don't hurt her again. Samuel said nothing. He simply sat there, silent, but deep inside. For the first time, he understood. He had lost the most important thing in his life, once, and this time, he wasn't going to lose her again. Learning to love. After his conversation with Daniel, Samuel drove straight to Amalia's house in Oaxaca. Night had fallen, and the warm glow from the windows cast a soft light onto the quiet street. This home had never had a place for him, but from now on, he wanted to be a part of it. He took a deep breath and pressed the doorbell. The door opened, and there she was, the same face, the same eyes. But now, instead of warmth, her gaze held something different: guardedness, a silent, invisible wall between them. Samuel. Her voice carried the surprise, but she quickly composed herself. Samuel didn't speak right away. He simply stood there, looking at her for a long moment. Then he finally said, his voice steady yet urgent, I want a chance. Amalia frowned. A chance for what? A chance to love you, he replied, and a chance to be a father again. Her heart trembled slightly, but she couldn't allow herself to believe him so easily. Samuel, I was never angry at you. Her voice was calm, but emotions swirled beneath the surface. Even when I left, I already knew there was no future for us. I never hated you, because when I loved you, I understood who you were. She paused, holding his gaze. I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I needed to love our son enough for the both of us. Her words struck Samuel like a knife. He had never felt so small. He had everything: money, power, yet he had lost the two most important people in his life. Samuel took a deep breath. I was wrong. His voice was low but firm. I was a fool to let you go. But Amalia, I can't change the past. I can only do everything in my power to make things right now. He stepped closer, his eyes unwavering. Give me a chance, not out of obligation, not out of responsibility, but because I truly want to learn how to love you, how to be a father, how to be a better man. Amalia looked at him for a long time. She could see the sincerity in his eyes. She knew Samuel was not the kind of man who admitted his mistakes easily, let alone stood before someone asking for a chance. But tonight, he had come to her, willing to break down his own walls. For the first time, he was choosing her. She didn't say anything. Love is not a promise. From that day on, Samuel was no longer just a distant presence. He spent more time with Oliver, patiently easing his way into the boy's life. At first, Oliver was hesitant. He didn't immediately see Samuel as his father, but Samuel never forced him. A park in Oaxaca, a superhero debate, Samuel's stepping into fatherhood, but Amalia's trust hangs by a thread. Can a billionaire unlearn his past, or will love slip through his fingers again? Timeland Stories is building to the end. Next part's a heartbreaker. Don't miss it. A love reborn. Hey, Timeland Stories family, Oaxaca's quiet parks turned into a billionaire's proving ground. Samuel Castillo's earning Oliver's trust, but can he win Amalia Vega's heart again? From superheroes to a spotlight proposal, this love's rewriting its rules. Get ready for a moment that'll melt you. Samuel Castillo never forced him. He listened to every Spider-Man story Oliver Vega told, learned how to play with him, took him to the zoo and amusement parks, doing things he never imagined himself doing before. Slowly, Oliver began to accept him, and so did Amalia. She couldn't deny it. Samuel had changed. He was no longer the cold, distant man from 5 years ago in Mexico City. He made no grand promises. He simply acted, without flowery words, without declaring that he would become the perfect man. He just stayed, quietly, steadily. He made up for what had been lost. Samuel had never been good at expressing love with words, but Amalia started to realize his love was in the little things he did for her. One morning, Amalia's phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. Samuel just posted a picture of you. She frowned, confused, opening Instagram. She froze. Samuel's profile picture had changed. The man who had never publicly acknowledged any relationship was now using a photo of them, a candid shot from a picnic with Oliver in an Oaxaca park. And on his personal page, he had posted another picture one of her laughing with Oliver, her eyes shining with joy. The caption was simple, only 5 words. The most important things to me. Her heart pounded. Samuel Castillo, the man who once viewed relationships as chains, who had spent years hiding behind his work, had now put her and Oliver at the center of his world. Before, his office desk had only been filled with contracts, reports, and an ever-glowing computer screen. Now, there was a framed family photo of the three of them, smiling in a park. Not just at his office. Another frame sat in his living room in Mexico City. Amalia couldn't deny what she was feeling anymore. One afternoon, Samuel took her to the Castillo Group headquarters in Mexico City. She hesitated as they entered the building, feeling slightly uneasy, but Samuel simply smiled and held her hand tighter. When they stepped into the conference room in front of hundreds of senior executives, Samuel declared with unwavering confidence, "This is Amalia Vega, my woman." For a moment, the room fell silent. Then whispers broke out. No one could believe it. Samuel Castillo, the man who had never publicly acknowledged any woman, had just introduced Amalia to the entire company. The media went wild. The Ice King has fallen in love. Amalia turned to him in shock. Samuel, what are you doing? He shrugged, completely unfazed. I just wanted everyone to know you're the most important person to me. Samuel had never been the type to send messages, but now, every day, Amalia's phone buzzed with small, thoughtful texts. Did you eat? Are you tired today? What do you want for dinner? I'll cook for you. And every evening when she returned home to Oaxaca, there was always a bouquet of flowers on the table, sometimes roses, sometimes baby's breath, sometimes small daisies, the ones she loved most. One day she finally asked, why do you keep buying me flowers? Samuel's response was simple, because I want you to always have something to smile about. Not only did he buy her flowers, he started learning how to cook. His skills weren't great, but every time he stepped into the kitchen, the warmth in the air was undeniable. They cooked together, They washed dishes together. Once, she teased him, "Samuel Castillo washing dishes?" He simply shrugged and looked at her with gentle eyes. "If it makes you happy, I'll do it every day." One evening, as the three of them walked through in Oaxaca Park, Oliver suddenly reached out and held Samuel's hand. Samuel froze. His gaze dropped to the tiny fingers wrapped around his own. Then a small voice spoke, "Dad." The world seemed to stop. Amalia turned sharply to look at Oliver, equally surprised. Oliver had never called him Dad before, but today the word slipped out so naturally, as if it had been waiting to be spoken all along. Samuel couldn't describe what he felt in that moment. A warmth spread through his chest, stronger than any success, any wealth he had ever achieved. For the first time in his life, he understood what family meant. Tightening his hold on Oliver's small hand, his voice came out quietly, a little unsteady. "Yeah, Dad's here." Amalia stood there, watching them, and her heart trembled. Maybe Samuel really had changed. Maybe she could give him a chance. A second chance. One evening, after putting Oliver to sleep, Amalia stepped out onto the balcony of their Oaxaca home, gazing at the star-filled sky. Samuel was already there, standing in silence, his eyes distant. She approached him slowly. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel turned to look at her. "The past, the things I missed." He paused, then let out a quiet, self-deprecating laugh. "I used to think I could live my whole life without love, but I was wrong." Amalia listened in silence. "I can't change the years I lost," Samuel continued, his voice steady, yet filled with emotion. "But Amalia, I want to walk with you from now on. Not because I feel obligated, but because I truly want to." She could hear the sincerity in his voice. "Amalia, thank you for giving me another chance," he said. Her heart trembled. For years, she had learned how to live without Samuel, but now, seeing him try, truly try to be part of this family, she couldn't deny that her heart had never stopped loving him. Taking a deep breath, she smiled softly. "Samuel, I never closed the door on you." A spark lit up in Samuel's eyes. Slowly, he reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Then this time, I won't let go." Amalia met his gaze, and for the first time there was no hesitation, no fear. She simply believed. And just like that, after years of being lost, two hearts that had once drifted apart finally found their way back to the same rhythm. The first time he said, "I love you." That night, rain drummed softly against the window, but inside the house, the air was thick with worry. Oliver had a high fever. Amalia had tried everything to bring it down, but his temperature refused to drop. He lay on the bed, his cheeks flushed red, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Samuel had never felt so helpless before. He was a man who thrived on control, who solved problems with precision, but now, seeing his son lying there, weak and exhausted, he wished he could take the fever upon himself instead. "What did the doctor say?" His voice was hoarse from worry. "We have to keep monitoring him. If the fever doesn't break, we'll have to take him to the hospital," Amalia replied. But the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Samuel nodded, but he couldn't sit still. He ran around the house, doing everything he could, switching out cool compresses, checking Oliver's temperature every hour, even calling a doctor to come in the middle of the night. He didn't sleep all night. He sat by Oliver's bedside, holding his tiny hand, his gaze filled with worry and love. Every time Oliver whimpered or furrowed his brows in discomfort, Samuel's heart clenched. Amalia saw everything. She had once believed that Samuel would never truly step into the role of a father. But now, watching him care for Oliver so deeply, so instinctively, she realized Samuel had changed. He loved their son. By morning, Oliver's fever finally broke. The boy's breathing was steady, his small body no longer burning hot. Amalia let out a relieved sigh. She turned to Samuel, ready to say something, but then she froze. He was still there, gripping Oliver's hand tightly, his eyes barely open, as if afraid that if he let go for even a second, his son might slip away again. And, at that moment, Amalia knew the man in front of her was not the Samuel from 5 years ago. She stepped forward and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Samuel opened his eyes and looked at her. For a long time, they stayed like that. Then, in a voice deep and certain, he said, I love you, Amalia, and I love our son. Amalia stood still, her heart trembling. It was the first time he had ever said those words. Not out of obligation, not out of fear of losing her, but because he truly meant it. She smiled, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. I know. Happily ever after. 2 weeks later, on a romantic evening, Samuel took Amalia to an elegant gala in Mexico City, telling her it was an event for business partners. She didn't suspect a thing, thinking it was just another work function. But the moment they stepped into the grand ballroom of the city's most luxurious hotel, Amalia knew something was different. The entire hall was adorned with thousands of white roses, her favorite. The soft glow of chandeliers, the gentle melody of classical music, and the warmth in the air made everything feel almost magical. Then, suddenly, the lights dimmed. A single spotlight illuminated the center of the room. Before she could fully process what was happening, Samuel took her hand and led her into the center of the ballroom. She barely had time to react before he dropped to one knee. In his hand, a small velvet box opened to reveal a dazzling diamond ring. The entire hall fell silent. Amalia's heart. A ring in Mexico City, Samuel's on one knee, and Amalia's world spins. From a fevered night to a gala's glow, is this the forever they lost? Timeland Stories is sealing this saga. Will love triumph or fade into the past? Next part's the finale. Don't miss the spark. Mexico City's Grand Ballroom holds its breath as Samuel Castillo kneels for Amalia Vega. 5 years lost, a son's laughter found. Can a billionaire's vow mend a broken past? This finale is a tear-soaked triumph. Don't miss the love that defied all odds. I once had the chance to be happy, but I didn't cherish it. I was afraid of love, afraid of responsibility. But you, Samuel Castillo's voice softened, his piercing blue eyes holding Amalia Vega's with sincerity and unwavering devotion. You gave me the chance to learn what love truly means. Thank you for standing by me. Thank you for showing me that family is not a chain, but the most precious thing in this life. He took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. I lost you once, and I swear I will never lose you again. This time I'm not asking you to marry me out of duty. I'm asking because I truly, deeply want you and our son by my side forever. Amalia Vega, will you marry me? Amalia froze. Time seemed to stop. She looked down at the man who had once been so distant, so closed off. The man she once thought could never love. But now, he had changed. Without hesitation, she smiled, tears shimmering in her eyes. Yes, the entire hall erupted in applause and cheers. Samuel stood, pulling her into his arms, lifting her off the ground in a whirlwind of overwhelming happiness. From across the room, Oliver Vega clapped excitedly, his laughter filling the air. He ran toward them, wrapping his small arms around both of them, and there they stood, a family, finally whole, surrounded by a sea of roses and love. 1 month later, their wedding was held at an exquisite seaside resort near Oaxaca, where the golden sunset painted the ocean in shades of amber and gold. It was no simple ceremony. Samuel Castillo had planned a wedding fit for the woman he loved. The media went wild. The Ice King has finally fallen in love. A billionaire who once feared marriage is now giving up everything for love. Over 1,000 guests attended, powerful figures from the worlds of finance, politics, and entertainment, but Samuel didn't care about any of them. His eyes were only on her. As Amalia stepped into view, dressed in a stunning white gown, the entire venue fell silent. Samuel stood at the altar, unable to look away, and as she walked toward him, his heartbeat thundered in his chest. When he took her hand, feeling her warmth, her presence, her love, he knew he had everything. The ceremony was bathed in the glow of candlelight, surrounded by flowers, music, and the quiet whisper of ocean waves. When it was time for their vows, Samuel held her hands firmly, his deep voice carrying through the air. Amalia, I once believed I could live my whole life without love, but then you came along and shattered everything I thought I knew. You showed me that love is not control, that family is not a cage, that happiness is not something to be feared. I once had the chance to be happy, but I didn't cherish it. Thank you for teaching me how to love, for showing me what true happiness is. From this day forward, and for the rest of my life, I vow to always stand by you and our son, to protect you, to cherish you, and to love you with everything I have. Amalia's voice trembled with emotion, but her gaze remained steady as she spoke. Samuel, I never needed a promise. I only needed you, a husband, a father. And now I know I've found him. They exchanged rings, and when the officiant announced, I now pronounce you husband and wife, Samuel pulled Amalia into a deep, passionate kiss. The crowd erupted in cheers. From the nearby garden, Oliver's laughter rang out as he played with the other children. Samuel glanced at his son, then back at Amalia, taking her hand. He squeezed it gently. I finally found what I spent my whole life running from, he said. Amalia tilted her head, smiling. And what's that? Samuel looked toward Oliver, then back at her, his eyes filled with love. A real family. Under the golden sunset, surrounded by the soft melody of the ocean and the gentle flutter of flower petals in the wind, Amalia leaned into the man she loved. She knew that from this moment on, she would never walk alone again. They had found each other, and this was their forever. A sunset vow in Oaxaca. Samuel and Amalia seal a love reborn, with Oliver's laughter as their heartbeat. From a billionaire's icy past to a family's warm dawn. Is this the end you dreamed of? Timeland Story signs off this saga. Did it mend your heart? Share below, and let's keep the love alive. Hey, Timeland Stories family. What did you think of Samuel, Amalia, and Oliver's journey? Did this ending warm your soul or leave you teary-eyed? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm eager to hear how it hit you. If this tale of love and redemption touched your heart, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that could inspire or uplift you. What's next? More tales of resilience, romance, or miracles? Tell me below. Your ideas fuel this channel. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next heartwarming story.